Good morning again. My name is Jon Stotts. For those of you who I haven't had the opportunity to meet yet, I'm the Director of Adult Faith Formation here at Christ the King Catholic Church. Welcome. I'm very excited that you all came out on this Labor Day Sunday. Perhaps it testifies to the importance of this topic for our community, but I'm very glad. Today's session is going to serve as an orientation to the following sessions to set up the conversation, to kind of set our expectations, and to help us be good learners, to create what one important professor of mine in grad school called a climate of repair, where we recognize that we're all on the way. We're all trying to figure out how to be human, how to be good humans, and that really the only way of doing that is to make mistakes. We want our mistakes to be small. We don't want to do harm, but we do recognize that we screw up. And so we need a climate of repair that will allow us to say, whoops, I'm sorry, and will allow others to say, thank you for saying you're sorry. Here's what you can learn from this. Now let's move on and take another step. Something I try, or I think we all try to do here at Christ the King. If you are visitors, if you are not parishioners, I welcome you with all my heart. Know that this series is truly for and has in mind Catholic parishioners here, which doesn't mean that you're not welcome. In fact, if you're visiting from other places, we need you here because you're going to bear witness to what happens when a community tries to wrestle with difficult topics of self-identity, of identifying who other people are and how we relate to them, especially in a history such as ours. So I don't know that I have anything to teach you. Those of you who are not regulars here, I don't know if I have anything to teach the others of you either. But I think we all have something to learn from one another as we try to have these conversations, even if it's just one thing we can do better moving forward. Anything else I should say before we just dive in? Okay. You can see an outline of where we're headed due to the way that the Jewish calendar falls this year on the weekends, which it doesn't always, but the year I decided to do this on Sundays, all the high holy days seem to fall on Sundays. We're sort of interspersing conversation with some folks from local Jewish communities with our own conversations, which I think will help us to pause and reflect, again, the us, that's the people here in need of this kind of reflection, on what we've heard so far, what we've learned, and what we can do going forward before hopefully being a good audience, a good receptive group of learners from those who are coming to teach us. This will not be the end. None of these series is ever the end for any of us, but hopefully it is a beginning. And as a beginning, I thought it would be important to answer the question, why this series? Why this series right now? Is this just Jon Stotts inflicting his own interests on people who don't know better one more time? It is that. It definitely is that. But as I reflected on how this arose in conversation with many of you in the room who helped me to plan this, there were three reflections or three insights that I think I've had and we've had over the past several years of adult education here that made it sensible, I think, for me to try to host this conversation about how Catholics are supposed to relate to Jews. The first came from a series that we did last fall at this time, a series on Vatican II. And as we remember, we went through not just the general principles of that council, but the minutiae, if you were there, of how these votes were taken and how motions got passed through an assembly of 2,000 plus bishops of the Roman Catholic Church, and the tremendous infighting and politicking that took place in order to help us to arrive at the documents that were promulgated. And we talked about a lot of changes. We talked about how the council was emerging out of a set of fault lines as the Catholic Church ceased to be a feudal state with its own armies and its own political clout, and began to be a religion, and just a religion in some sense. So I don't know that anything is ever just a religion. And the two options were always, we have to keep doing what we've always done, or we can dare to do something differently. And we talked about how various documents on liturgy, on scripture, emerged out of these wrangling conversations in order to point a way forward. We touched on it, but we didn't get a chance to talk about it deeply, and we will in 2 weeks. We didn't get to spend a lot of time on one of the last documents to be promulgated, Nostra Aetate. There are copies at the table for you to read if you haven't read it, or its English title, Declaration on the Relationship of the Church to Non-Christian Religions. As we'll talk about in a couple weeks, this was initially supposed to be just about Jews. It was supposed to be a document about Judaism and sort of Catholicism and its relationship to the Jewish people. But it got broadened and encompassed sort of everybody, with pride of place in the last few paragraphs given to reflections on our relationship with the Jews. Contrary to more than a millennium of church teaching on both official and local levels, based on this document, the Catholic Church now teaches that the sacred covenant established between God and the Jews, this is Catholic language, has never been revoked. We're going to talk a lot more about this, but this teaching has huge implications for what we think we're doing here, what we think a church is, and what the church is supposed to do. As a corollary to this, though the document doesn't say it, sort of ancillary documents do come out and say it, it means that Christians no longer have to think that they have to convert Jews, right? That we are all on the same path, or maybe different paths leading up the same mountain, or we'll get into problems with the metaphors later. But this is a reversal of church teaching and practice. And anyone who tells you that it's not hasn't read this carefully, unless I'm horribly mistaken, and I'm open to that. So for me, that's exciting that this church teaching is changing. And I say it's changing because even though it's true on the level of the document, it's not necessarily true on the level of the popular reception of this teaching. Not all Catholics know this, and not all Catholics are taught this, even in a grade school. So teaching changes, that is, our ability to transmit this truth changes. And so a series like this makes sense. Secondly, also related to the Second Vatican Council and the movements that led to it, how we read the Bible is changing. Another of Vatican II's influences on Catholicism is its effect on how we read our sacred texts, especially with respect to our better understanding of its context through emerging historical and archaeological evidence. As we've learned over the past year from Justin Brinkley, former parishioner who's now safely ensconced at Boston College, studying the New Testament, the world of Second Temple Judaism into which Jesus is born is far more interesting, pluralistic, and complicated than we ever imagined. Now more than ever, we benefit from reading our texts with a thorough understanding of Jewish origins and context. And as I hope we'll see in ensuing sessions here, it's not like Jews have been remiss in developing ways of reading the scriptures over the past 2,000 years. And that's something that I think I've encountered in some biblical scholarship that thinks that Judaism stopped when Jesus was born or when the temple was destroyed, and that there isn't 2,000 years of wonderfully beautiful and complicated biblical rabbinic tradition to learn from. So we all benefit from these conversations if we want to read the Bible wisely and with open hearts. And then finally, our world is changing in some ways. This is a picture of Charlottesville in 2017. This is what I think is a fair generalization. In times of growing social and economic unrest, Jews tend to find themselves targeted more often as threats. As far as I understand it now, the U.S. has been a pretty good place to be Jewish, all things considered. Less true in the South, but sometimes in other places. I think of like Detroit with Henry Ford. But in this country, Jews have found ways to flourish at all levels and dimensions of society, and I find that really heartening. At the same time, the number of anti-Semitic incidents in the US last year was the highest since the Anti-Defamation League began keeping track in 1979. President Biden created a new task force within Homeland Security to deal with anti-Semitism for the first time. And the threat here isn't just an anti-Semitism that targets Jews, it's the growing popularity of white supremacy, enemy of both Jews and Catholics, which has had a long legacy in this country, and, which I'm sorry to report, has apparently been able to find a comfortable home in Catholic churches and among Catholics. But essential to Catholicism, in the words of a theologian by the name of David Armstrong, is the, quote, fundamental validity of Judaism as an ethno-religious way of life, in some sense revealed by God. Without our preserving this fundamental validity of the Jewish life, Catholicism doesn't exist. It simply doesn't. And so, out of self-interest, which is always a motivator, if we're not going to be generous, anti-Semitism is a threat to the character of our church. So 3 things: how we receive the authentic teaching of the Catholic Church and its teaching regarding the Jews, how we can learn to read the Bible again in a way that opens our hearts and our minds, and supporting a culture that is open to diversity, education, pluralism, shared resources. All these 3 factors have prompted this question, and this will be our question today. And again, this we I'm speaking of is the we of Catholic parishioners of Christ the King. And I invite those of you to step into this we insofar as you are comfortable, but I don't demand it. Obviously, I can't. How do we tell the story of Catholics and Jews? How do we tell this story? I think of my daughter, who's in 4th grade here, as she learns about religious history, and one of her classmates is Jewish. How is Eloise, my daughter, learning the story of Catholics and Jews? What am I telling her? How is her classmate learning the story? What's she learning from Catholic school? What's she learning at home or from temple? What are they learning? How do we tell the story? Is there a way to tell the story of our Catholicism for those Catholics in the room without needing to create enemies, people who are not us? Can we witness to the truth of our experiences? For Christians in the room, maybe we've had experiences of Jesus, or what we would describe as that. Can we witness to the truth of these experiences without needing to make enemies or others? How do we tell the story of Catholics and Jews in a way that's faithful to history, which we must be, and also open to what God is asking us to be in the world? I don't know the answer to this question. That's why I'm doing this series. You have to figure this out. We all do. So the funny thing is, the gospel is a story about how love overcomes violent hatred, apathy, and death. For me, Jesus is a sign of divine love that won't stop until it reconciles all enemies, knits back together all wounds, and repairs the world until there won't ever again be people sobbing with grief and horror over what they've experienced. But the most horrifying puzzle is this: the communities who gather in the name of Christ, linked together through word and sacrament throughout the ages, who carry the seeds of this gospel of hope and love, the story of how love overcomes violent hate. We who literally tell the story of God's attempts to achieve solidarity with all humans every Sunday, that's what we're doing over here, what we think we're doing. We whose sign of peace, a sign that is of our peace with one another, with everyone, that handshake before communion, that's the condition for us to receive the body of Christ, whatever that means. We who claim to be this body are historically among those who have caused the most suffering to Jews. How do we tell that story? From the screeds of early preacher theologians like John Chrysostom, to the tradition of Holy Week pogroms that took place all over medieval Europe, to the ground in Germany that proved so fertile to the seeds of Hitler's project. Hitler, who was baptized a Catholic, even if he renounced it later, such that the Catholic Church, horrified as it was, proved unable to prevent his popular support. Our history, a Christian history, seems riddled with evidence that we don't believe our own story. So how do we tell that story? We don't need to be too morose. There's counter-evidence. There's hope. Despite the popularity of Jewish hatred in the 5th century, the influence of Augustine's theology managed to carve out a safe-ish place for Jews in his theology over against someone like Chrysostom, as those who are protected by God, of course, protected like Cain is protected, cursed to wander the earth to show witness to Christ, because eventually everyone will recognize that he is the Messiah. As we heard about the last 2 weeks, Christians managed to live alongside Jews under Muslim rule in the early Middle Ages in Spain. As historians of Jewish history like David Myers argue, despite their marginalized position in medieval Christian societies and the periodic outbreaks of horrific violence, Jews did okay, especially when we compare them to serfs. And Catholics did speak out, and in individual cases act out against the racist propaganda and program of extinction of the Nazis out of their own Christian convictions. So we're a mixed bag. I have no illusions it will continue to be a mixed bag. But I've come to see that the question, what does it mean to be Catholic, has always involved answers to the question, what are the Jews? What does it mean to be Jewish? In fact, trying to answer those questions lead to things like the Inquisition. We have to figure this out because we're not safe. Answers to this question until recently have come in the form of dualism. To be Jewish is to be not Catholic, to be anti-Catholic, and to be Catholic is to be anti-Jewish. But if we don't see Jews, we Catholics, as enemies, who are they? If Catholicism is not the enemy of Judaism, what are we? Can we hold a place in our minds for both kinds of identity, Catholic and Jewish, without needing there to be an other, needing there to be some kind of an enemy? And how do our conceptions of God saving the world change when Catholics begin to see our relationship to the Jews differently? So now it's your turn. At tables, and if you find yourself, no one's alone, I want to take a little time to share, insofar as you're willing, your responses to these questions. And those of you who aren't Catholic in the room, I invite you either to listen if you don't want to share, but if you want to share, either respond to what you hear or tell your own story, fixing the words as you need to, about learning about how your own religious identity relates to that of the dominant society around you. So those of you who are Jews in the room, maybe tell us a little bit about what it was like learning about what Christians are and whether that's changed over time. But really, these questions are to help us learn and unlearn what we've carried into the room, and at least be open about it to ourselves so that we can continue to learn going forward. So these 3 questions, if you're willing to discuss them at your table or listen quietly as others discuss them, there are sub-questions of how did you learn to tell the story of Catholics and Jews? First, what did you learn growing up learning about Jews? How do you understand the relationship between Jews and Catholics? And how has your understanding and or experience of this relationship changed over the course of your lifetime? I have 10:05. I will check in 10 minutes to see if there's still good conversation happening. Okay? Go for it. All right. Somewhat illuminating. Is that okay? Good. Okay. So I'm going to give us some versions of the story that I've heard. And maybe you can find where your version of the story growing up or now is located. And if there's some slippage, if there are versions of this that don't fall into these boxes that I'm going to erect for us, we'll want to hear about that. So here's one version. Catholicism is the only way to God, or if we're being generous, Christianity. But we know. And Jews are going the wrong way. So the fancy word for this is supersessionism, which means that the church, Christianity, has replaced Jews in God's plan. So the story can go something like this. The Jews were the chosen people, related to God by the covenant established through Moses. Then Jesus came and established a new religion, Christianity, or Catholicism, open to Jews and non-Jews at the beginning, but the Jews killed Jesus, who was God. His new religion fixed a lot of problems with Judaism. When he was raised, this Jesus, some Jews began to follow him, and they ceased to be Jews. And non-Jews began to follow him too. These were the new chosen people. The Jews who did not recognize Jesus as the Messiah and who still not are no longer the chosen people because they are still following the old religion and they are guilty of killing God. While Jesus, who is God, came to establish the new religion. Christianity has replaced Judaism. Sort of the hardcore version of this is, in fact, not only are Jews no longer the chosen people, but they are the anti-people. They are the rejected people because they are openly rejecting Jesus on purpose. So Jews are especially damned unless they repent and become Christian. Anyone hear any version of this growing up or in theology? Hands? This was the theology of the Catholic Church for about a millennium, at least. Some exceptions, but this was the story. If you were a Christian growing up in Europe, anywhere from 400 to about 1500, you heard some version of this story. Okay, another version. Catholicism is a better path to God than Judaism or Christianity. Maybe we call this covenantal development. The church has updated Judaism. So again, the Jews are the chosen people, knit to God by the covenant established through Moses. Jesus came and fulfilled this covenant, offering people the fullest way to fulfill their obligations to God by following the spirit and not the letter of the law. And Jesus is, in fact, God in the flesh. Some Jews conspired with the occupying Romans to have Jesus killed. When he was raised, some Jews began to gather in his name as a religious community while continuing to practice as Jews. And non-Jews began to gather as a religious community too, but they did not become Jews when they did this. Some Jews did not believe that Jesus had accomplished God's plan for saving his people from sin and death, and so they went on just being Jews, trying to live out their faithfulness to the covenant. Such Jews who do not recognize that Jesus is the fulfillment of their own law are still kind of chosen. But since they don't say they follow Jesus, they're not as chosen as those who say they follow Jesus. Christianity is better in every way than Judaism, but the Jews still have a chance to recognize Jesus because the old covenant foreshadows him, and that's how they'll be saved. Anyone recognize this story and what you've heard or were raised with? This is also familiar to me. Okay. Let's see what else we have. Judaism is a better path to God than Catholicism or Christianity. A different kind of covenantal extension. Catholics can follow God, but the Jews remain God's chosen people. The Jews are the chosen people, knit to God by the covenant established through Moses. Then Jesus came and offered some interesting commentary on Jewish belief and practice. He got himself into trouble, as prophets do, and was killed. Some of his followers reported experiencing visions of him after his death, and they began to spread the word that this Jesus was the Messiah Israel was waiting for. Jewish communities tolerated this novel idea. There had been a lot of weird and novel things happening over the past centuries. What's one more? But as more and more Gentiles began participating in the Jesus movement, its Jewish origins and practices got sidelined, and it got harder to play nice with the Christians. Once the Romans destroyed Jerusalem, and Palestine, Jewish communities and Christian churches had to find new ways of surviving in the empire, and this put them at odds with one another as they sought new forms of self-definition and political advantage. In this, the Christians won. They got the lion's share of political power. Thank you, Constantine. They made life pretty hard for the Jews, who they considered to be enemies. Nevertheless, despite the fact that Christians are wrong about Jesus being the Messiah, does it look like we're in a new age? There's a lot to like about the New Testament, if it's read with its Jewish context in mind. In fact, probably the best things about the New Testament and Christianity are the things that it shares with Judaism. Anyone hear this story? Okay, got one. Okay. Catholicism and Judaism are different, but equally effective paths to God. Call it dual covenants. Christianity and Rabbinic Judaism are two branches growing out of the same Second Temple Judaism tree. The Jews are the chosen people related to God by the covenant established through Moses. Then Jesus came and fulfilled this covenant, offering people an embodied example of what it looks like to be perfectly obedient to God, God in the flesh. Some of Jesus' fellow Jews conspired with the occupying Romans to have Jesus killed. When he was raised, some Jews began to follow Jesus while continuing to practice as Jews, and non-Jews began to follow him too, but they did not become Jews. Some Jews did not believe Jesus had accomplished God's plan for saving his people from sin and death, and so went on just being Jews, trying to live out their faithfulness to the covenant. But with the events of the Jewish Civil War, the destruction of the temple, revolts through the 2nd century, destruction of Jewish life in Palestine, both Christian and non-Christian Jews had to develop new ways of living out their understanding of God's covenant as minorities in a polytheistic empire under the scrutiny of the Roman Empire. What we call Rabbinic Judaism emerges as a way for Jews to do this in the Hellenic cosmopolitanism of the Roman Empire, and what we call Christianity emerges as a way for non-Jews to do this in the same context. But since human communities frequently need to maintain their self-identities by finding some other who is different enough to be not us and close enough to be a threat, Jews and Christians have spent 2,000 years defining themselves as not being the other one. And since, through some strange turn of events, Christians have had political power for most of this 2,000 years, Jews have often gotten the worse end of the stick in this bargain. In this theology, Jews do not need to convert to Christianity. Judaism and Christianity are still growing and developing, and each is a legitimate way of following the God who is restoring the world. The big question here is, who is Jesus in this? Anyone recognize this? Seems a little bit more in line than some. Okay. There are many paths to God, and this whole thing is foolish. Labels are confusing. It's great and important to belong to these big, serious religious traditions, since they've historically been occasions of communal life, beauty, ethical reflection, even miracles, the best and brightest of what humanity is. And humans seem to need in-groups to help them flourish. But there's more to the world that we don't know than we do. And religious claims to certainty deserve our curiosity and our skepticism. Belonging to a religious tradition is good because we need myths and rituals to help us get oriented to the mystery of life. But belonging to these religious traditions should help us embrace our commonalities more than they should encourage us to destroy those who are not like us. And anything in them that fosters hate should be discouraged. Any people or institutions who use religious belonging to threaten the flourishing of other people are the real threat. Or perhaps my own tendency to use my religious belonging to threaten the flourishing of other people is the real threat. Is this familiar? Okay. So in this, there is a God. There are lots of ways, and labels are confusing. Any others? Any slippage here? I tried to capture, at least from my vantage point, sort of a range of options available to Catholics growing up today. Maureen.
I think one that I have heard often is that, all these other religions are fine, but they're just not the best for Catholics.
Yes, yeah. And that's I think a version of this is best and the other ones are fine. They're fine. This one's best for me, for us, for everybody. That's the question. other ways of negotiating this difference. Again, part of what is motivating this series is that option one has been with us since the beginning, and it remains with us. And so as we read our own history and tell the story, we can't forget that, but we do have to address it. There could be maybe, we're going to talk more about Nostra Aetate in week 3 of this series, but I do want to make good on my claim that the church changed its position. So here are 3 quotes from this document, the entirety of which I've spread out at the table. It's not long. And we're going to talk about the context of it in 3 weeks. But here's what the church says. Indeed, the church believes that by his cross, Christ, our peace, reconciled Jews and Gentiles, making both one in himself. And again, although the church is the new people of God, the Jews should not be presented as rejected or accursed by God, as if this followed from the Holy Scriptures. And finally, God holds the Jews most dear for the sake of their fathers. He does not repent of the gifts he makes or calls he issues. Such is the witness of the apostles. Now we'll talk about what makes these statements such watershed moments in the life of the church, and how close we were to not having them in a couple of weeks. So if you're interested in that history, and I think it's an interesting one, come back. But if this is current teaching, and of course teaching develops, but if this is current authoritative teaching for Catholics, what do we do with these 5 categories? Can we safely dismiss one of them or 2 of them? Right, yes. Number 1 is gone, right? We can no longer say this, that Catholicism is the only way to God. Just being Catholic in the world today is the only way you get to heaven, or however we want to do it. And especially the Jews are going the wrong way. We can't say that anymore. There are question marks on some of the other ones, and we'll talk about what Nostra Aetate leaves open and what it questions. But it does leave room for maybe a 6th. The Catholicism expresses the one path to God, and it does it with reference to what Jesus did. And Judaism expresses the same path without that reference. That's the question. Could this be true? Is this one way to navigate if we don't want to make enemies, and if we want to recognize any authenticity? This is perhaps one way forward. So here's what we're going to do coming up, and we'll finish up by kind of debriefing what we've talked about today. Next week, Rabbi Rami Shapiro is going to come and speak on everyday Jewish practices. That's a huge topic, and I just told him to have fun. If any of you have ever encountered the writings or work of Rami Shapiro, we're in for a treat. Google him, that's all I'll say. But he'll have lots of good things to say that'll help us Catholics orient to just what it's like to practice as a Jew, things that maybe we've never encountered, and will allow us to begin to see what we have in common and what real differences are here for us. After that, we're going to talk about this document, Nostra Aetate, the arguments that led up to it, how it came to be included in what the council promulgated, and the options it leaves open for Catholics who wish to continue being happy Catholics, doing the Jesus stuff, and embracing sort of a more pluralistic understanding of what God is doing in the world. We'll seriously consider what the church holds open to us as we seek to continue on as Catholics. And of course, we'll be ready to listen to anyone who has things to say about this. In week 4, the 3rd week listed here, Patty Marks, who teaches scripture at the temple here in Nashville, is going to come and talk to us about reading the Jewish scriptures. There can sometimes be a misconception. Again, I mentioned this at the beginning, that the Jews stopped reading and interpreting the Bible and is sort of stuck in the Old Testament, as I've heard some Christians describe it, as though there aren't multiple and various and wonderful traditions of reading the scriptures and deriving spiritual nourishment from them that have taken place coextensively with Christian readings. And it's my contention, not just mine, that we have a lot to gain from learning how to read our own scriptures with these sensibilities in mind. Next, we'll talk about anti-Judaism, so myths and misconceptions that still persist in Catholic belief and practice and ways that we can remedy them. I think we'll especially be looking at two things. One, how the New Testament talks about the Jews, especially in John's Gospel, and how this continues to plague us. The writings of Amy Jill Levine will help us here. And then the emergence of some other myths about Judaism, Jews, that have taken place over the past 100 or 200 years and still may have infiltrated our understanding of who we are. Maybe the highlight of this is going to be on the 8th of October, panel discussion with folks from local synagogues who are going to talk about being Jewish in Nashville in the South, growing up. Q&A format. I'll have some questions to start with that I've talked with them in advance about. But it's designed really to give us the flavor of people who are willing to be vulnerable about what it's like growing up in the South, about what it's like deciding whether your kids are going to play football on a Friday night or if you're going to do Shabbat. You know, things that Catholics have not had to negotiate because we have grown up in a Christian world. But which once upon a time, Catholics did have to negotiate because there were more stark differences between us and our historic enemies, the Protestants. And then finally, we'll end up with Rabbi Strasberg from Shearith Israel coming to talk about the Jewish High Holy Days, which will have just concluded, and we'll have lots to learn from him. So comments, questions, concerns? Yes?
You can't make all of those. Are you going to record any of them? Or?
With the permission of our speakers, I will record them. And full disclosure, I did record today's, but I only recorded me. So none of you are pictured in this. I really tried to be sensitive to what having a camera on or a microphone on in the room does to the ability of a group to share. So if we record, it will be just single face facing someone else. And we didn't record the conversations because we do want this to be a space where we can share. But I will do my best to record these. Yeah. Other questions, comments, concerns? What do you want to learn? Why would you keep coming back if we do this? Any thoughts? Yeah, Victor.
Just a small one. My interpretation is, I'm hesitant to say this, but I feel sorry for the Jewish faith because of my ignorance, that their God is a harsh one and angry God and punishing God, whereas Jesus brought us a kinder relationship. And so I'm very anxious to learn about their view and kind of the trust in their life and God and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's an interesting challenge. This notion that, you know, the Old Testament is angry at us and Jesus reveals the new God. And we'll have, I think, the opportunity to talk about that. The two things I'll say are this. Any of you raised by Dominicans? Any of you know about the Catholic angry God? Okay. There is a Catholic angry God. And his... the evidence of his passing among us is Catholic guilt. That sense that we're never quite enough. So, you know, we may talk a big game about happy Jesus, but man, we feel it. And also, I'd also point out that, you know, for worshiping a really angry God, Jews I've known have been really funny people and really kind people and people willing to extend generosity to those among them. In fact, like a lot of humans I know. So somehow worshiping this angry God of the Old Testament hasn't manifested in any kind of spiritual malnourishment. So it makes me wonder if we're quite right about that. If the God of the prophet Isaiah or the God who delivered the slaves out of Egypt, is in fact so angry as we make him out to be, or when we need there to be an angry God? It's a good question that we'll continue to wrestle with. Other questions or things that you hope we get to talk about? Maureen?
I like to hear from the Jewish people that are going to be speaking to us what their impressions of Catholics are. And are, do they feel that attitude of superiority coming from us? I'm just curious because I've never really grown up or been around Jewish people. I just wonder if that is part of what they have to deal with.
Yeah, Maureen, I have the same curiosity, which is, of course, rooted in self-interest. Like, am I okay? Are we okay? But,
They like it.
do they like us? Are they even our friends? And also, as we all get to know actual humans who participate in these big religious traditions that come laden with stereotypes and assumptions, are there people who have had to unlearn what they know about Catholics because they've met us? Or do we fit true to whatever assumptions? And that's part of the human quest, right? We learn about people through the groups they belong to, and then we have to unlearn as much of that. I'm certainly doing that all the time. Others, I saw some other hands. Yes?
I want some facts, just objective facts, in that my learning doesn't have a lot of facts, so I'm grateful for some facts.
Yes, we'll definitely get facts about what it's like to be Jewish today. If you want historical facts, in addition to the presentations, which we'll touch on some of those, I've given some resources that I have found personally helpful on a single sheet in front of you. I'll update that as I hear from you and what's been helpful for you. These are a variety of levels, from the popular to the overtly academic, but they're all really solid, both in terms of history, of Jewish history with an eye to Catholicism, and also in terms of how we grapple with these difficult realities. So those of you who want facts, begin your reading. And I would recommend, as a starter, if you're looking for something small, it's on this. David Meyer's Jewish History, A Very Short Introduction, is really fine. It's a really fine read. And he has a YouTube analog of that, a talk he gave maybe at NYU, I can't remember where it is, called Jewish History in an Hour. It's really good. Does what it suggests, kind of, as one can. Other things you want to learn before we close? Carolyn.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you. I think this is really important for us to do, and I know it can be a hard topic, but I'm really glad we're doing it. So thank you for putting it together.
You're welcome. You're welcome. And I hope, thank you. As with everything here, my job, as I understand it, is to plant seeds. So that we can grow some good spiritual fruit. So hopefully some action will come out of this. That is, we're not just going to learn to think better and be able to look at ourselves in the mirror and say, well, now I'm enlightened, time for dinner, which we'll do. But hopefully we can change and we can be different and we can find ways for this community and the wider community to take action. And that's up to you. It's up to all of us to figure out ways of doing this. Okay, to close, I want to close by making you all sick with the text. This is an excerpt from a really lovely monograph written by Abraham Joshua Heschel, a very famous scripture scholar and theologian and Jew of the last century. And he wrote this address to sort of sum up in a lot of ways his life's work. And here's some excerpts. In the world of economics, science, and technology, cooperation exists and continues to grow. Even political states, though different in culture and competing with one another, maintain diplomatic relations and strive for coexistence. Only religions are not on speaking terms. Over 100 countries are willing to be part of the United Nations, yet no religion is ready to be part of a movement for the United Religions. Or should I say, not yet ready? Ignorance, distrust, and disdain often characterize their relations to one another. Is disdain for the opposition indigenous to the religious position? Granted that Judaism and Christianity are committed to contradictory claims, and they are, is it impossible to carry on a controversy without acrimony, criticism without loss of respect, disagreement without disrespect? The problem to be faced is how to combine loyalty to one's own tradition with reverence for different traditions. How is mutual esteem between Christian and Jew possible? And he goes on, what then is the purpose of interreligious cooperation? It is neither to flatter nor to refute one another, but to help one another, to share insight and learning, to cooperate in academic ventures on the highest scholarly level. And what is even more important, to search in the wilderness for well springs of devotion, for treasures of stillness, for the power of love and care for humankind. What is urgently needed are ways of helping one another in the terrible predicament of here and now by the courage to believe that the word of the Lord endures forever as well as here and now, to cooperate in trying to bring about a resurrection of sensitivity, a revival of conscience, to keep alive the divine sparks in our souls, to nourish openness to the spirit of the Psalms, reverence for the words of the prophets, and faithfulness to the living God. We pray to the Lord. Lord, thank you, and I'll see you all next week.